I wanted to be the best at whatever I did. And I wanted to be the best serial killer, yes. I've probably done anything a man would want to do with a woman. Obviously, I must be sick somehow. Normal people don't do what I did.
Richard Francis Cottingham, born on November 25, 1946 in Mott Haven neighborhood of Bronx in New York City. A white guy born in a middle-class family and living in an urban area of New York. A fairly normal man by the looks of it, if you ask me. But true crime buffs know that Cottingham isn't just remembered by this name only. Otherwise known as the New York Ripper, the Torso Killer, or most famously as the Times Square Killer, let's take a deeper dive into the story of New Jersey's most notorious serial killer.
It was a very big story because of how gruesome it was.
These were very bizarre and bloody crimes. Beheaded, burnt, chopped up.
Some narcissists absolutely believe they are invisible, they're untouchable.
Richard, who's already convicted of 11 murders, admitted to 5 more gruesome killings last year. But what's the actual number of his victims? How did he start on this pathway, and what eventually caused him to get caught? Before coming on to his recent claims, let's take a look at some of his history. Early life. Soon after his birth, Richard's family moved to New Jersey, first to Dumont, and then later on to River Vale. In the year 1964, he graduated from Pascack Valley High School. This was the time when his fascination, or obsession is probably the right word, with bondage pornography started. Later on, it was established that this obsession was one of the key factors behind his heinous behavior. On May 3, 1970, Richard married Janet, but because of Richard's erratic behavior, the marriage only lasted 8 years, when his wife filed for divorce in April 1978 by citing different reasons such as abandonment and mental cruelty. Introduction to the life of crime. Unlike most of his fellow serial killers, Cottingham's first crime wasn't a murder. On October 1969, he was convicted of drunk driving in New York City 2 years later. In 1972, he was again convicted of shoplifting at a store in New Jersey. A year later, he was arrested because of a more serious crime when a prostitute filed a complaint of robbery, sodomy, and sexual abuse against him. Similarly, 2 years later, in 1974, Cottingham was arrested again in New York City for robbery on the complaint of another prostitute. Unfortunately, during all this period, the police or any other law enforcement agencies had no idea that the guy they had apprehended was actually a serial killer. Making of a serial killer. According to Cottingham, his killing spree started during his adolescent years. His first victim was Nancy Schiava Vogel, a 29-year-old mother of 2 who was strangled by Richard on October 28, 1967. Vogel's body was found 3 days later, bound in the backseat of her own car. Like all of his other murders, this case remained unsolved till August 2010, where Richard himself confessed and told the police about the murder. Just 4 months after his first murder, Richard killed another woman on February 15, 1968. This time, the victim was 23-year-old Diane Cusick, who was found raped, beaten, and strangled to death in the backseat of her car, just like the first case. This case, too, remained cold until 2022, when Cottingham was charged for the murder because of new evidence brought up by DNA findings.
So in 1968, the police did a great job looking for any leads they could find. They spoke to hundreds of people at the Green Acres Mall to see if anyone had seen Diane. Unfortunately, it went cold. The trail went cold and the case went cold. It wasn't until 2021, because of the advancements in DNA evidence, that we were able to retest some of the evidence that we had found in that 1968 murder. And when we retested it, we came up with a DNA sample. When we uploaded it to the National Data Bank, we got a hit telling us that it was Richard Cottingham. He is currently incarcerated in a prison in New Jersey.
March 22nd, 2022, grand jury of the County of Nassau, under indictment number 70607-22, indicted you for the following charges: murder in the second degree,
During same time period, Richard killed another woman who was a 13-year-old girl named Jacalyn Leah while she was returning from her band practice when Richard got a hold of her. Leah vanished on July 17, 1968, and next day her body was found strangled in a park, whereas her face was severely beaten. These three killings, which according to experts were sexually motivated and had a somewhat same method of strangulation, established Richard as a serial killer operating in the area of New Jersey and New York. The torso murders. Like I have mentioned before, Richard Cottingham, like his fellow serial killers, had several nicknames, and one of the famous ones was the Torso Killer. But how exactly did he get this name? On the eve of December 12, 1979, nearby firemen in New York City responded to an alarm at the Travel Inn Motel that's just close to the Times Square. When they went inside the room, the scene was nothing short of a horror film. They found two bodies in the room, one of a 22-year-old sex worker named Deedeh Goodarzi, and another one of an unidentified woman who was estimated to be aged between 16 and 22. What made these murders even more gut-wrenching were the nature of them. Both of the bodies that were found had their heads and hands removed, and after that, both of them were burnt using lighter fluid. Unfortunately, Richard had already fled the scene, and the police didn't find any evidence that could lead them to the killer. During an interview in 2009, Cottingham admitted to the torso murder and explained that the heads and hands of bodies were removed to prevent the identification of bodies. He also admitted that he was acquainted with Goodarzi, whom he met a night earlier in a bar. These were the murders that gave this unknown killer a name of Torso Killer. Arrest. Finally, the day came when this devil with the mask of human was arrested. In the early morning hours of 22nd of May, 1980, Richard picked up an 18-year-old girl named Leslie Ann Odell from a corner in Manhattan. Just like some of his previous victims, Leslie matched the profile of a sex worker aged between 16 and 30. He took her to a motel named Hasbrook Heights Quality Inn, which is quite baffling because this was the same motel where he had left the body of one of his previous victims. During dawn, they checked into the room, and after some time, Richard began assaulting Leslie. Soon, Leslie's cries because of the torture became so loud that the motel staff called in the police and rushed to the room demanding that Richard opens the door. Cottingham was fortunately apprehended by the police in the hallway of the hotel while trying to flee from the scene. Now what's even more daunting are the things that he had along with him when he was arrested. Handcuffs, 2 slave collars, a leather gag, a switchblade knife, some replica pistols, and a buttload of prescription drugs. I mean, if this doesn't tell you how much of a sexually motivated maniac he was, then nothing will. A crying, screaming, and severely injured girl and these extremely weird things found on him were enough for police to arrest and charge him. After the arrest, he was charged with several charges related to kidnapping, attempted murder, rape, sodomy, and possession of a lethal weapon. But the question here arises that how did police come to know about his previous murders, as this case, with all of its weirdness, still didn't prove that he was a serial killer? After his arrest, which by the way was in the year 1980, police searched Richard's home and car. In a locked room that was in his house's basement and his car's trunk, police found different type of personal belongings which were traced back to different victims of similar cases. And that's how it was established that Richard was not a one-time assaulter or murderer, but in fact, a serial killer. Convictions and confessions. The details that followed after the arrest were nothing short of a complete horror show. Soon after his arrest in 1980s, police started connecting the dots, bringing forward convictions of 5 murders in 3 different trials. Cottingham was convicted of a murder in a New Jersey trail in 1981, then for another one in 1982, and then finally for 3 murders in New York in 1984. Although the authorities didn't have any conclusive evidence to support their stance, but they were more than sure that during this period of 13 years, Cottingham had committed at least 17 murders. But how did he get away with them easily? Why did police not get any evidence against him? Well, this question is answered by many experts stating that he wasn't just a normal criminal. Even in that era before the DNA analysis, Richard was, according to experts, very aware of forensic techniques and procedures. This might be the reason that during several murders and 13 long years, only 1 fingerprint of Cottingham was recovered, which was then used to build a case against him. But even after all these evidences, fingerprints, and getting arrested while trying to flee from a murder scene, Richard still wasn't accepting any of his crimes. He kept pleading innocent of all charges and maintained strict stance that he was being framed. However, eventually in 2009, after almost 3 decades of his arrest, he admitted that he had killed those 5 girls. Just a year later, in 2010, he pleaded guilty to another murder, this time of Nancy Vogel. After this confession, authorities started digging and interrogating him to find about other cases, and as a result, he confessed to murdering 3 New Jersey schoolgirls in exchange for immunity from persecution. 11 years after this, in the year 2021, he pleaded guilty to the 1974 kidnapping, raping, and drowning of 16 years old Lorraine Marie Kelly and 17 years old Mary Ann Pryor. Now these confessions took the total tally of murder convictions to 8. But this wasn't all. Most recent confessions. In 2022, Richard Cottingham was made to appear before court straight out of his prison hospital bed. The case was of murder of Diane Cusick in Long Island, New York, which took place in the year 1968. Now, what made this case get even more media attention was the fact that, according to authorities, this was the oldest case yet to be solved and prosecuted by direct DNA evidence. Richard admitted to the crime in a December court hearing, also admitting to 4 other murders. He pleaded guilty to gruesome murders of 4 women in Long Island during that period named Mary Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Maria Emerita Rosado Neves. Following this confession, Richard got another 25-year sentence added to his current life sentence as a part of a plea deal with authorities. Emphasizing on the importance and gravity of the case, District Attorney Ann Donnelly said at a news conference that, "Today is one of the most emotional days we've ever had in the Nassau County District Attorney's Office." During the hearing and press conference, she was joined by the families and relatives of several victims of Cottingham's deadly murder spree. But even after this many number of convictions, more and more cases are being discovered that are directly linked to Richard. In March 2023, retired officer Robert Anzalotti got another confession from Richard, this time of the murder of 17-year-old Mary Ann Della Sala, who disappeared in 1967 while she was returning from her job in Hackensack, New Jersey. The unknowns. While many convictions and charges have been made, the total number of women that fell victim to the torso killer's wrath are still unknown. In different interviews or talking to various other sources, Richard has claimed that the actual number is way above than 100 victims. Almost all of his victims were adolescent girls or adult women, while most of them being somehow related to prostitution. It can be said that his crimes were sexually motivated, but if we think there's actually no explanation that why a man would turn so wild and evil. Hundreds of cases in the area of New Jersey, New York, and Florida remain unsolved, and all of these areas were mentioned by Richard as his areas to hunt. The severity and extremeness of his killing spree can be easily judged by the fact that cases linking to Richard are still coming to surface even after more than 4 decades of his arrest. The serial killer is now 76 years old and obviously still serving time in Trenton's New Jersey State Prison for his crimes against humanity, but who knows how many lives he had actually taken and how many more he would have if he hadn't been arrested that day. We'll get back to you with more stories. Until then, adios.